and welcome to the Philly Factor. My name is Paul Perillo. Well, for 40 years, there's been a show on television that has set the standard for children's television programming. It's been a friend to children, a companion, as well as educator, a vital staple for children to get that jump start on their ABCs or 1, 2, 3s. And while Sesame Street delivered its message to children with music, puppets, and stories, many parents would agree that watching Sesame Street with their children was and continues to be part of their daily routine. So, how do you take 40 years of quality children's television in Sesame Street and attempt to tell the story of one of the most successful programs on television? Well, Michael Davis has managed to do that. He has come out with a new book. It is called Street Gang, The Complete History of Sesame Street. It documents the start of Sesame Street in the 1960s up to today. And while we've all taken Sesame Street for granted, that it would be there every morning for our children and grandchildren, the show's success was anything but guaranteed. And we welcome to the Philly Factor Michael Davis. Welcome to our program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here on Blue Sweater Day.
That's right. You got the memo, and it's in honor of Cookie Monster, right? Who's also actually, I guess even Cookie Monster has sort of gotten with the times, and he doesn't necessarily chow down all the chocolate chip cookies.
He mixes in the salad every once
in a
while.
That's exactly it. But it's a remarkable story, given the fact that it was a chance encounter, if you will, that Jim Henson had with someone that sort of got this show, up and running?
Yeah. Jim Henson was a known factor back in the 1960s for his advertising. And that was my first encounter with Jim Henson, these wonderful commercials for La Choy Chinese food. And he created this dragon, a walk-around Muppet that whose tail would knock cans off the shelves, and he was outrageous, and he breathed fire. And that was my first real, first moment when I understood this incredibly satiric comedy using puppets as a way to sort of see ourselves.
Sure.
And then Jim Henson was on the television show with the Muppets, and he was a known factor, but it really wasn't until he signed on in 1969 to be part of Sesame Street that his career really rocketed. Mm-hmm. And, he came in at a very important time in the development of Sesame Street. There were pilots shot in the summer of '69, and some segments were working great with the test audience and kids, but the segments that were shot on the street were not. Mm. And that's because at that time they only had actors working the street.
Sure.
And that's when Jim Henson came in, and he brought to life a sketch that had been on his pad for years of this ungainly, tall, yellow bird that he always wanted to create, and he created it for Sesame Street. Of course, it's Big Bird, and then it became Bert and Ernie and Grover and Cookie and a whole cast of Muppet characters that have become iconic in our culture.
You mentioned the word Muppet, and you can't think of Sesame Street without the Muppets. But who coins the phrase then, Muppet? Because it was a puppet, but were they just looking for a different word to sort of, cluster all of Henson's creations?
Let me tell you how smart Jim Henson was. He knew about branding before people were talking about branding, and he was really a very young man, just out of the University of Maryland, working at WRC in in Washington, rather, and he realized at that young age that if he created nomenclature, if he created a signature phrase to describe his puppets, which he believed were vastly different from puppets elsewhere, and because he made them with fabric and foam, and they were so pliable, and they had such texture to them, he wanted them to have their own names. So that's how the word Muppet was created. And there's disagreement about whether it was a coming together of the marionette and the puppet to make Muppet. Mm-hmm. Some people say yes, some people say no, and Jim Henson, unfortunately, isn't here to give us an answer.
Sure, yeah. It was very sad because he was such a young person when he passed away, and perhaps may have even, if he would have gotten himself the medical attention or gotten himself even to the hospital sooner than he did, he might be here today to really see his world grow by leaps and bounds. I mean, it started with this with this television show, Sesame Street, and although he had some television exposure and some television work, like you mentioned at the outset, I mean, it really, it seemed like in the 1990s, it really took off. I mean, there was always Sesame Street, but then we have the whole, legion of Muppet movies that sort of come out. And then we have the Muppet television show. And then, of course, the whole partnership, if you will, originally with Disney, and then ultimately Disney acquiring the rights to the Muppets, minus the Sesame Street characters. But it's a shame that he did pass away. Didn't really live to see, although he was around to see, I guess, the acquiring by the Disney company of some of the Muppet characters.
Well, not quite. I detail in the book how he died at the absolute worst time in terms of the deal that was on the table between the Walt Disney Company and Jim Henson. Jim had been working for Disney without a contract for a year, but the deal that where it was said to have been $150 million had yet to be signed. And at the beginning of the book, I take people to the memorial service for Jim Henson in the spring of 1990, which was a remarkable event. Someone said it was the only memorial service that could have been taken on the road, so entertaining it was. And I take people to that memorial service and explain that Michael Eisner, the Walt Disney Company, is sitting in a pew and looking at the assembled gathering and wondering to himself, what now? Here they were going to buy an entrepreneurial company, and the entrepreneur is gone at age 53. So, the essential tension that I set up at the beginning of the book is that, Jim's memorial service was the most incredible coming together of all of the worlds of Henson, people that he worked with in the movies and on television and Saturday Night Live, and everybody was there at that moment. And of course, everyone he worked with at Sesame Street was there. And there was a big question back in 1990 about what would happen with these characters, what would happen with Kermit, what would happen with Ernie, signature characters that not only did Jim create, but performed. He was a fantastic business person, but first and foremost, he was an incredible artist. With Jim Henson and Frank Oz, who was his friend and associate, probably were the two greatest puppeteers of their time. And so when he died, not only did the business have big question marks associated with it, but the art of the Muppets was in question. Would they ever be as good if he was not there?
Yeah. He made a concerted effort, though, early in his career, that he would keep the Sesame Street characters aside or apart from his other Muppet creations.
Yeah.
And was that his wanting to do that, or was that Children's Workshop that said, we have these characters over here that are synonymous with Sesame Street, and I guess is Kermit the only one that sort of crosses?
Yeah, he had
both.
Yeah, he had one little foot in one world and one little foot in the other. I think it was a combination of things. First and foremost, Jim was very engaged in the process of creating Sesame Street and sustaining Sesame Street, and he still believed in the experiment of trying to use television to teach preschoolers. He was really committed. So it's no surprise, really, that he said, these characters that I created for the show, I want them to be in a separate category. Now, he retained ownership of those characters, the trademark, but the licensing and merchandising money that was made from them was split between Sesame Workshop, which was then called Children's Television Workshop, and Henson. And it was responsible for a lot of revenue for a lot of years. So it made business sense, but it also made sort of psychological sense in a way for Henson, because he really thought of those characters as being so different from the other worlds in the universes of the Muppets, most notably the characters that we know from the Muppet Show on TV.
One thing is that early, when Sesame Street finally gets up and running, gets on the air, there was there concern that the show wasn't going to be able to sustain itself, or that the show might last a few years, it might last maybe 10 years at best? Did anybody realize that 40 years later there would actually be not just one book, but a number of books, and DVDs and characters and merchandising that would come. It was. Did they ever realize that early?
The opposite. They all thought it was a gig for a year or two, if they were lucky, because the seed money for Sesame Street came from the federal government and from philanthropy, from the Carnegie Corporation and the Ford Foundation. And, those agencies exist to get things started, but they don't stick around for long,
Sure.
You got to find a way to sustain yourself. And so, they thought when that money ran dry, that would be the end of Sesame Street. But thank goodness they were able to find a way to create a revenue stream through that licensing and merchandising of the characters. And I'm old enough to remember what a sensation Sesame Street was when it debuted. I mean, it was crazy. Within a few months, everybody knew those characters. Every child in a stroller had a Big Bird or a Bert Ernie doll.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an incredible success.
Sure.
Nobody thought it would last 40 years, and it's only because of the resourcefulness and the intelligence of the people behind the show that it has lasted 40 years. And luck.
And luck, and luck is always good. That's right. So I know that you mentioned when you first met Henson many, many years ago, he was working as an advertising whiz, if you will. You worked at TV Guide then for quite some time. So at what point did you sort of realize that there was this phenomena, if you will, that was Sesame Street, that every kid was in a stroller with a Bert or Ernie doll, or that, there was, Tickle Me Elmo was all over the place. I mean, where do you realize, as a writer for TV Guide, that this is something? I mean, this is going to become part of the fabric of our
We have to
culture.
go way, way, way back. We have to go back actually to its debut in 1969. I was a high school student, but the show caught my eye because I really was interested in the Muppets. I loved them from, as we said, from the commercials and from Ed Sullivan Show. So I watched a preview of Sesame Street that NBC aired the weekend before it began its run on PBS, and I thought, I remember being a high school student thinking, man, this is incredible, this show, what they're trying to do here. So right from the start, I had an interest in the show. And then when I was in college, I worked at a daycare center, and then after college, I worked for Project Head Start as a teacher. So preschoolers became an interest of mine. And then, later on, when I worked at a series of newspapers and magazines, and finally at TV Guide, and covered children's television, I had this great, great opportunity to write a piece about the 35th anniversary of Sesame Street, and that's what really got me started. But I think I've appreciated the show most of my adult life, and always, I'm a big believer in humor as the way. I think humor's the universal lubricant. I think it makes the world go round, and I've always found the show to be very, very funny.
So is it the humor then that is the root of the success of Sesame Street? I mean, you write a book. Is there a holy grail, if you will, at Sesame Workshop or Jim Henson Productions that you sort of turn to page 477 and there's the key ingredient to success? I mean, you mentioned luck, but I mean, all your experience with Jim Henson and Sesame Street. What is the root of their success? What is the key to the success of Sesame Street?
Well, I think it's the fact that they always looked upon the show as being an experiment, a renewable experiment, and they never let it get stale. They approach each season looking at, what they did the year before, what they could do going forward, what's new in child development, what's new in that children need that's in their zeitgeist. And so because they've been able to kind of keep refashioning the show and making it relevant while holding on to those core characters that we love, I think that tells part of the story. Humor absolutely is part of the story. And that, right from the beginning, the producers and writers of Sesame Street decided that they would try to create a show that would not be, that adults could tolerate, that mom and dad or grandma or the older babysitter or sibling could sit down and watch with a child and find it entertaining.
Sure.
And I think that's been very true of Sesame Street all the way from the beginning. That's why they brought in pop stars, jazz stars, classical artists, dancers, the greatest of the great, appeared on Sesame Street. It was as much to bring the adults in as it was to entertain the children. And what they found by doing scientific research over the 40 years is that children learn so much more when there is an adult in the room watching with them, significantly more. There's that. And then there's this. Part of I call this stealth, the stealth curriculum of Sesame Street was to inoculate children into the culture, to show them who Ray Charles was, Yo-Yo Ma, Itzhak Perlman, to give kids a little bit of a taste of what was great about this country, what's great about the arts in this country. And I think they've been very successful at it over the years.
The other thing, too, that's great about Sesame Street is that it knows no boundaries, meaning that you could be a green puppet, you could be an orange puppet, you could be dressed as pigtails, you could have spiked hair, and everybody's accepted. So when you talk about diversity, from the very beginning, Sesame Street was teaching us diversity and to be accepting and welcoming to all different types. And just because, they happen to be puppets, it sort of was maybe a reflection back at us, whether us adults or us as a culture, that, maybe we could take a lesson from these puppets that are living, Muppets that are living on Sesame Street, that we need to be all accepting.
You said that beautifully, and that was their goal. Their goal was to make a television show where people got along, where characters were tolerant of one another and kind to one another, and solved their problems with words. And yes, they were yellow and blue and magenta and every color of the rainbow for a reason, And yes, Sesame Street very boldly in 1969 had the first integrated cast on television. And without making a big show of it or a big deal of it, it just was the way it was on that street. That was Sesame Street.
Sure.
And all kinds of people lived in that brownstone 1, 2, 3 Sesame Street.
Some of the contemporary challenges then for the show, and I guess given just production values that go into a program today, they've sort of kept up with the production values. It's still equal to, if not far better than some of the other shows, children's television shows, and some of the other shows that even on prime time, if you will. I mean, it's always stayed pretty much in front of the technology, staying very much in tune with what's going on in the world.
That's true.
And yet, you go back and you could watch episodes from the early years, maybe at the 20-year mark, the 35-year mark, and they're constantly, I don't want to say they're reinventing themselves, but it looks like they've never lost their focus, never lost their mission, but they continue to stay contemporary. And a lot of people would say that they might shortchange the show because they really don't need to stay contemporary. They could bring out repeats from last year or the year before or whatever, but they continue to stay out and be cutting edge as much as they can.
Yeah, they're not interested in resting on their laurels. They're really interested in pushing things forward. And, recently Sesame Workshop has done some great work, for instance, with videos for children whose families have been deployed overseas, or children who live in families where dad or mom came back disfigured and lost an arm or lost a leg. And, that's remarkable work for a television production company for children to kind of take on. It's courageous work, and it's good for us, and that's what they're interested in. They honor their past, and they release the box sets of Sesame Street material. Actually, they've released 2, and there's another one coming, I believe. And they're delightful, and they honor their past, but they really are interested in tomorrow. And that's what I think they're a very impressive organization. They're not perfect. They've done some things over the decades that they probably wish they hadn't. But on balance, Sesame Workshop has done a phenomenal job of creating domestic television, but also taking the idea of Sesame Street and spreading it across the globe to more than 140 countries now. It's amazing.
It really is. We kidded at the beginning of the show about Cookie Monster,
Yes.
who loved to eat cookies.
Yes.
And I guess, given the trend today of, cookies not necessarily being the best thing for kids to eat if you want to have a healthy kid. So they sort of adapted, or they sort of changed the focus, if you will, that he's not munching now on all cookies all the time. He said he occasionally throws in a salad.
Yeah.
And the other thing, too, with is it Oscar that's in the trash can?
Yes.
Oscar the Grouch. And a lot of people would say, well, why should you have a character that's living in a trash can? Because some people might turn around and say, well, that's either a swipe at people who are homeless and they're living on the streets of America. But, when all is said and done, he happens to be, even though he's a grouch, tends to be a warm and fuzzy character. I think that somebody a character we can all relate to, because chances are going to encounter somebody like that on a day-to-day basis, whether it's the workplace, at school, whatever. So, they've sort of gotten some flack for some of these characters, but yet they still remain part of the show, and they haven't really changed.
Yeah, I think they've always looked upon flack as being a good thing, that criticism of the show has always been considered, and they've responded to it reasonably, and, I think that they did a good thing with Cookie Monster. And the attempt was to say that cookies are sometimes food, not a food that you have exclusively. And they were responding to an epidemic in the United States of childhood obesity. And they thought that cookies' obsession might have been sending out a wrong message. But they had to do a dance, because Cookie's no longer funny if he doesn't have his obsession.
Mm-hmm.
He ceases to be funny. Oscar would cease to be funny if he didn't habituate a trash can and have a world under his feet where there's an elephant down there in that can. He's no longer funny. So, it's always a delicate balance. The writers are always challenged to keep things sharp and satirical, but also try to reach the educational goals and the sort of the social goals of the show. Not always hard to do. I mean, not always easy to do.
The name Sesame Street, I mean, they could have called it Muppet World, they could have called it Puppet Place, they could have called it anything.
Yeah.
So where does the Sesame from Sesame Street come from?
Okay, well, they had a devil of a time coming up with a title for the show. And it really came down to the 11th hour. 11th hour and 59th minute. And the executive producer of the show, Dave Connell, dispatched everyone to come up with new lists of titles. And somebody who wasn't really in the sort of the target area in terms of the most important people at CTW, somebody who was out in the periphery came in with a list. And that name, Sesame Street, was on that list. And it caught the eye of a couple of people. But a lot of people didn't like that name and thought it was going to be a disaster. Of course, it turns out that it was the perfect name for the show without knowing it. And, some people say it was for, open sesame, opening new worlds, opening doors. But there really is no definitive answer as to why they chose it, except to say that Dave Connell said, if I don't have a better one by Monday, this show is going to be called Sesame Street. And it was.
It was. The name of the book, again, is Sesame Street. Street Gang, right. It is Street Gang, The Complete History of Sesame Street by Michael Davis. It's got Oscar the Grouch there on the front cover. We mentioned, the pivotal role, the integral role that Jim Henson played in the success of the show. His passing, it seemed like he was gone, but the show and his empire never really missed a beat. And I guess it's because he had worked so hard and so long to sort of, ingrained all the people that worked with him on Sesame Street, that this is the way that the show needed to go, and that this is the way, in order for the show to be a success, that, even though he dies and he passes away, the integrity of the show really doesn't skip a beat. Although, on the other side, now that the Disney organization has acquired the rights and the Muppets are actually part of the Disney empire today, the integrity of what these characters were and where they are today really hasn't changed, and I'm guessing that's a lasting tribute to Henson himself.
Yeah, I think one easy way to explain it is Jim Henson hired very, very well. he had a great eye for talent, and he built an organization that was very closely knitted, and he had tremendous loyalty from people he hired, and he set out for them a way of doing business that became a culture and embedded in everyone's sort of DNA. And I think it's no surprise that they kept going out without him, because they all were so clear about what the mission was as communicated to them by Jim Henson. And now there's a third generation of Muppet performer, and they all have that in their hearts too, and they never worked for Jim Henson. But, it's funny. When he passed, I think, for a lot of people, it was like the day Kennedy died. It's like everybody knows where they were when they heard that Jim Henson died. He was sort of like an uncle to us in a way, that subversive uncle who could tell a great joke and be satirical and love to be around kids, but not exclusively trained on kids. Because he really was a family entertainer when you think about it. The Muppet Show was, as they say, fun for the whole family. It was written in such a way that really everyone in the family could sit down and watch and enjoy it. And that's what he wanted. He did not want to be a children's performer. He wanted to be a family performer.
Well, you have done a wonderful job in getting 40 years of history of this show into a wonderful book. And and it's I'm hard-pressed to believe that people wouldn't want to go out and get the book just to learn the insides of what went on in the early days, or what went on when the Walt Disney Company had sort of talked to Henson about acquiring his Muppets. Or if you're just looking for a good read, I mean, it is a wonderful book that sort of takes a snapshot of where we are in society, what children's television has been, where it is today, and really a great reflection of this 40-year history, 4 decades. It's amazing that the show continues to thrive and survive the way that it does, when most television shows, they're lucky today if they last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, 40 minutes. This show's been on the air 40 years. I wanted to write a book about the power of a great idea, and that's what Sesame Street was in '69 and continues to be.
All right, well, we thank Michael Davis for being with us here on this edition of the Philly Factor. Until the next time, thanks so much for being with us. I'm Paul Carello.